Welcome to Terramouth, where the night doesn't just hold secrets, it remembers them. Story 1 ***, The Hollow of Tranquil Creek. It was a small town with a forgotten name, Tranquil Creek, nestled deep in the heart of Tennessee. Surrounded by miles of thick forest and winding roads, Tranquil Creek seemed almost too perfect, too peaceful. The type of town you'd find in an old postcard, where the clock tower ticked in time with the gentle pace of life. That was Kun, until the night the bells rang for the first time in decades. I first heard about Tranquil Creek when I was assigned to cover a series of underrated small towns for a local magazine. The editor was enthusiastic about the place, promising me it was one of the best kept secrets in the state. No one seemed to know about it, and no one talked about it, at least not publicly. That intrigued me. So, I packed my things, grabbed my camera, and made the long drive, hoping to get a few good photos and stories for the article. When I arrived, it was exactly as advertised: peaceful, quiet, and hauntingly beautiful. The town seemed frozen in time, with the main street lined with old Victorian houses, each one more charming than the next. A small grocery store on the corner, a coffee shop with a few worn-out chairs and faded posters, in a barber shop that looked like it hadn't been touched since the 50s. Nothing screamed haunted or suspicious, but there was an undercurrent of stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The local inn was cozy, run by a kind woman named Helen who had lived in the town all her life. When I asked her about the town's history, she smiled politely, but her eyes grew distant, as if the subject were one she preferred to avoid. I pressed her gently, and she told me that the town's founder, a man named Silas Westbrook, had built the church at the center of town in 1865. He was a pious man, and the church bells had been a crucial part of the town's identity. But one night, the bells stopped ringing, and no one could explain why. The town moved on, and the church eventually closed its doors. The bell tower, however, remained, silent and standing at the center of Tranquil Creek. Helen didn't elaborate further, but I noticed the way her eyes darted around the room. The unease was palpable, but I chalked it up to her being an older woman in a small, forgotten town. Perhaps she was simply lonely. Still, the town's history intrigued me, so I decided to take a walk that evening to explore the church and its bell tower for myself. The moment I arrived at the church, a strange feeling swept over me. The tall stone building stood silently against the dimming sky, its towering spire cutting into the clouds. The doors were closed, and the bell tower stood above, eerily still. The area surrounding it was oddly well kept, like someone had been tending to it, even though no one seemed to know who. The air was thick, and the scent of wet leaves and old wood mixed with the smell of something unfamiliar, almost metallic. I walked around the church, my camera clicking away, but there was a sense of heaviness in the air that I couldn't ignore. As I rounded the back of the church, I spotted something strange. A small shed, hidden from view, with its door ajar. Curious, I approached it. The wooden door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing nothing but dust-covered shelves and boxes. But as I looked closer, I noticed something odd: a faded photograph pinned to the wall. It was an old black-and-white image of the church, taken decades ago. But there was something unsettling about the people in the picture. There were no smiles, no warmth in their eyes. Instead, their expressions were vacant, almost as if they were trapped in the photo. I pulled the photo off the wall and studied it, my heart racing. I was about to turn and leave when I heard the faint sound of bells ringing in the distance. At first, I thought I was imagining it. After all, the bells had stopped ringing decades ago. But the sound grew louder, clearer, and it sent a shiver down my spine. The bells' tolls echoed across the town, reverberating in the air like a warning. The same sound that had once marked the passage of time now felt like a harbinger of something far more sinister. I rushed back to the inn, hoping to shake off the feeling that had gripped me. Helen was sitting at the counter when I entered. Her eyes locked on me as if she had been waiting for me. "The bells," I said breathlessly. "They rang." I heard them. Helen's face turned pale, her hands trembling. She stood up slowly, her voice a whisper as she spoke. "You shouldn't have gone to the church," she said. "The bells. They've been silent for over 50 years, but they're not just a symbol of the town. They're a warning." Before I could respond, a loud crash echoed from outside, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps approaching the inn. I turned, my heart racing, but when I opened the door, there was nothing there. The streets were empty. Helen's face was pale, her expression one of pure terror. "You've seen it now, haven't you?" she whispered. "The bell calls those who are meant to be chosen." The next morning, I couldn't shake off the strange feeling that had clung to me the night before. The ringing of the bells, the odd photograph, and Helen's cryptic warning all weighed heavily on my mind. I decided to return to the church and investigate further. The sun was up now, but even with daylight, there was something suffocating about the town. I couldn't quite place an invisible force that seemed to press down on me. Helen had insisted I leave Tranquil Creek, but I couldn't, not yet. I needed answers. As I walked through the town, I couldn't help but notice how eerily quiet it was. No cars, no children playing, no voices in the streets. It was as if the village was holding its breath, waiting for something. I reached the church by midday, but this time I wasn't alone. A few of the townsfolk had gathered near the gates, standing in silence, their eyes fixed on the bell tower as though waiting for something to happen. I approached one of them, a man in his mid-40s with a weathered face and a nervous twitch in his eyes. His hands trembled slightly, as if he'd been waiting for this moment his entire life. "Is something going on?" I asked. He didn't look at me. His gaze remained fixed on the church. "The bells ring when they're called," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. "They choose the ones who will listen." "Choose?" I repeated. "What do you mean?" The man turned his eyes to mine, and in them I saw a depth of fear I couldn't ignore. "You've heard it too, haven't you?" he asked. "The bells. You're chosen now, just like all the others." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the town. Confused and unsettled, I made my way into the church. The doors creaked open with an eerie finality, and I stepped inside. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of old stone and must. The space felt wrong, stagnant, as if it had been frozen in time. The pews were empty, but the altar at the front was lit with candles that flickered in an unnatural windless breeze. The atmosphere inside was oppressive, like the walls themselves were closing in. I made my way toward the bell tower, climbing the narrow staircase that spiraled upward. The walls were cold to the touch, and with each step, I felt my unease grow. Finally, I reached the top, and there it was, the bell, hanging silently in the tower. I was so close now, I could hear its faint resonance, almost like it was calling to me. The rope that would pull the bell down swayed gently, as if moved by an unseen hand. I reached out to touch the rope. Suddenly, a loud, distorted voice echoed from below. It was Helen's voice, but it sounded distant, as if it were coming from another world. "Don't pull the bell, please," she cried. "It's too late now. You've awakened it." But it was too late. I had already grasped the rope, and the moment I did, the bell rang. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard. Deep, resonant, and somehow ... alive. It filled the church and spilled out into the streets. The earth seemed to tremble beneath my feet, and I felt a rush of energy surge through my body, as if something had been unleashed. I stumbled backward, the rope slipping from my fingers. The bell tolled again, louder now, and something shifted in the air of darkness, an oppressive force that seemed to fill the room. The sound of the bell didn't stop. It continued to ring, faster and faster, until it was no longer a sound but a presence. Something began to move in the shadows of the church, something old, something ancient. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. A cold presence that brushed against my skin like a whisper from the past. I turned and ran, down the stairs, through the church, and out into the streets. The bell continued to toll behind me, echoing through the town like the pounding of a heartbeat. I could hear the footsteps again, but this time they weren't behind me, they were all around me, surrounding me. I looked over my shoulder, and the townspeople were following me. Their eyes were wide, hollow, and dark. Their faces were twisted with something I couldn't comprehend: fear, hunger, longing. They moved toward me in unison, like marionettes being controlled by an invisible force. I stumbled back, heart racing. "What do you want from me?" I shouted. The man I had spoken to earlier was the first to answer. His voice was flat, lifeless. "The bell chooses. It always chooses," he said, his voice a hollow echo. "And once you're chosen, you must answer." I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like something had anchored me to the ground. The air around me thickened, pressing down on me, and I could feel the walls of reality beginning to crack. I was slipping, falling into something dark. Then, in an instant, it stopped. The ringing stopped. The pressure eased. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The townspeople stood motionless, watching me with their empty eyes. "Why?" I whispered. "What is this? What's happening?" And then, from the dark, the voice I had heard earlier spoke again. It wasn't Helen's voice anymore. It was something else, something deeper, more ancient. "Do not answer the bell, child," it said. "Do not answer it. Once chosen, there is no escape." And with that, everything went dark. Story 2: The Hollow of Windcrest. Windrest was a sleepy town nestled in the hills, surrounded by dense forests that never saw much daylight. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and nothing much changed. However, when I returned to Windcrest after years of absence, I found that the town had been marked by a darkness I couldn't escape. I had grown up in Windcrest, but after high school, I left for college, never intending to come back. When I heard my childhood friend, Sam, had gone missing, something pulled me back. There was no trace of him, not a single lead. The town seemed to brush it off as just another case of someone wandering off, but I knew better. Something was off. The first thing I noticed when I arrived at the outskirts of Windcrest was the silence. The forest, which once had a lively buzz of birds and rustling leaves, was dead quiet. The trees stood still, their branches twisted and gnarled, like they hadn't moved in years. I walked through the town, and it was as if time had forgotten it. The houses looked abandoned, though they were still occupied. The windows, once full of life, now stared back at me, dark and unblinking. I went straight to Sam's family home. His mother, Gloria, greeted me with a tight smile, her eyes hollow. She hadn't slept properly in weeks. She invited me in, but barely said a word. "I don't think Sam left on his own," I said as we sat across from each other in her dimly lit living room. "Something happened to him." Gloria only nodded. She seemed distant, not just emotionally, but physically. It was as if she wasn't fully present, like part of her soul had been left behind with her son. She showed me Sam's room, untouched, as if waiting for him to return. That night, I couldn't sleep. The town felt alive with secrets. The wind howled outside, pressing against the walls of the house. I sat up, staring at the window. The shadows outside seemed to move, flickering and shifting unnaturally. A loud knock on the door startled me. I opened it to find a man standing in the doorway. His face was covered in shadows, but I recognized his build. "Sam," I whispered, though I knew it couldn't be him. The man's face was too gaunt, his skin too pale, and his eyes hollow like the rest of the town. He didn't speak, but his presence sent a chill through me. He stepped into the room, and I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. He pointed to the woods, his finger jerking unnaturally, and mumbled in a language I didn't understand. Then, as quickly as he arrived, he disappeared into the night. I rushed to the window and looked out. The wind was still, but something in the forest seemed to call to me, something ancient and dark. The next day, I went to the local library, hoping to uncover something about the history of the town. I met with Miriam, the librarian, who seemed oddly eager to help. She handed me a dusty old book that detailed Windcrest's founding. "Be careful with that," Miriam said, her voice shaky. "Some stories are better left buried." As I flipped through the pages, I found a mention of an old ritual. The town was founded on land once believed to be cursed, home to an ancient being. It said that every generation the town had to offer a sacrifice to keep the dark force in the woods at bay. I thought it was a superstition, a story to keep the children in line. But the further I read, the more I realized how much of it aligned with what I was experiencing. Later that evening, I decided to visit the forest. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find, but I knew I couldn't ignore the strange events any longer. The woods were dense, the trees like looming giants, their branches stretching out like claws. The air felt colder here. My breath came out in visible puffs, though the temperature hadn't dropped. I walked for hours, until the trees opened up to a small clearing. In the center stood a large, old stone structure and altar. It was overgrown with moss and ivy, and the stone was cracked. But it was unmistakably old. I approached it slowly, feeling the weight of 1,000 eyes on me. As I reached the altar, I felt a sudden wave of nausea, as if the earth itself was rejecting me. Then I heard Itha whispering, low, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It felt like it was coming from the ground, rising up from the very earth itself. Before I could react, I was knocked off my feet by an unseen force. My body hit the ground hard, and I felt a sharp pain in my chest. When I looked up, the shadows seemed to move, swirling around the altar. Something inhuman stepped forward from the darkness. Its form was grotesque, with limbs too long, its skin slick and black dot. It spoke in a language I couldn't understand, but its eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, seemed to stare straight through me. It wasn't just looking at MIT, was looking into me. Then I remembered the book, the ritual, the sacrifice. The creature's eyes seemed to grow wider. And I knew it wasn't just watching, it was waiting for me to give in. Before I could make sense of anything, the ground beneath me trembled. I felt something pull at me, dragging me toward the altar. I screamed, but no sound escaped my throat. The air grew heavy, pressing down on me, and everything went black. When I awoke, I found myself lying in the clearing, the creature gone, but the feeling of its presence still lingering. I gasped for air, my chest heaving, as though I had been drowning. My limbs felt numb, as though they had been paralyzed for hours. The ground beneath me was cold, and the wind had died down, leaving an eerie silence that pressed in around me. I stumbled to my feet, disoriented and afraid. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around, hoping to find something familiar. But all I could see were the trees, towering over me like dark sentinels. The altar was still there, its jagged stones looming in the distance, as if they were waiting for me to return. I had to leave. I couldn't stay in this cursed place any longer. But as I turned to make my way back through the forest, I felt it again, the pull, a tug deep within me, like something was drawing me back toward the altar. I fought it, but my feet moved of their own accord. My body was no longer mine to control. The forest had claimed me, and the creature was watching, waiting for me to return to its grasp. My mind raced with fear as I pushed forward, my every step heavy and sluggish. I had to break free from whatever dark force had taken hold of me, but the more I resisted, the stronger the pull became. The trees seemed to close in on me, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, grasping for me. Then I saw it, the altar again, just ahead. It was impossible. How could I have ended up back here? The creature was standing beside it, its dark eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It made no sound, no movement, but somehow I could feel it watching me, observing my every move. I stopped in my tracks, terror rooting me to the ground. "You came back," the creature said, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. I couldn't speak. My throat was dry, and the words wouldn't come. I was paralyzed by fear, unable to move or make a sound. It stepped closer, its long limbs stretching unnaturally, its eyes never leaving mine. "You can't escape," it whispered. "You belong here now, as all of them do." The last words echoed in my mind, and I realized what it meant. I was just another soul trapped in this cursed town, doomed to become part of its dark history. The creature reached out, its hand cold as ice, and touched my forehead. I screamed, but no sound came. My vision blurred, and the world spun around me. I felt myself sinking into the earth, the darkness swallowing me whole. And then everything went black. When I awoke again, I was back in my bed in Windcrest. The room was dim, the early morning light filtering through the curtains. I sat up, my heart racing, gasping for breath. I looked around, disoriented, unsure of what had just happened. Had it all been a dream? Had I really been in the woods, facing that thing? But when I looked at my hand, I saw the marks, the deep, twisted cuts that had appeared during my time in the forest. The creature's touch had left its mark, and the memory of it was burned into my mind. I couldn't escape it. I rushed to the window, hoping to see something familiar, something that would tell me I hadn't lost my mind. The town looked peaceful, as it always did. But as my eyes scanned the horizon, I saw something that sent a chill down my spine. In the distance, just outside the town, stood the clearing. The trees surrounding it were dark, and the altar loomed in the distance, just as it had been in the forest. It wasn't just a dream, it was real. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it couldn't be true, that the altar wasn't there. But deep down, I knew. The town had been hiding something that went back generations, and I was now part of it. I couldn't leave Windcrest. I couldn't escape the curse that had been placed on this land. The creature would never let me go. The wind howled outside, shaking the windows of the house, and the trees swayed like they were alive. A deep, low rumble vibrated through the walls, as though the earth itself was groaning in agony. I could hear whispers, faint at first, but growing louder. The creature's voice echoing through my mind, calling me back to the altar. The pull was strong, and I could feel it in my bones. It was only a matter of time before I returned. The town of Windcrest had claimed me, and now I was part of its curse, forever bound to the darkness that dwelled in the woods. I glanced at the door, feeling a cold breeze blow through the cracks. The creature was calling me. It wanted me back, and this time there would be no escape. Story 3 ** The Haunted Ferryman of Norrington, USA. Norrington was a small, secluded town nestled on the banks of a murky river. Its history tangled with whispers of strange occurrences and inexplicable happenings. There was always something off about the town, something that couldn't quite be explained, but no one dared to question it. The older generations spoke of the river with reverence and caution. They called it the Ferryman's River, and they avoided it whenever possible. The younger folks had heard the stories, but few paid attention. However, for those who truly knew the history of Norrington, the river was not something to be trifled with. I had grown up in Norrington, and while I had heard the old tales of strange happenings, I never thought much of them. That was until I returned one fateful winter evening after a long time away. My father had passed away, and I returned to take care of the family estate, which included the large, dilapidated house my family had lived in for generations. The house stood on a small hill overlooking the river, casting an eerie shadow over the town. It was a place I had tried to forget, but one I could never truly escape. I hadn't set foot in Norrington since my childhood, and the weight of returning after so many years was more than I had bargained for. But I had a duty, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. The night I arrived, the wind howled through the bare trees as snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, covering the ground in a blanket of white. The town was quiet, save for the creaking of the old wooden houses and the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. As I drove up to the estate, a sense of unease settled over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I checked into the old guest room my father had always kept ready for visitors. The room had a musty smell, but it was comfortable enough. The night was silent, but there was a strange weight to it. I thought it was the house, its creaks and groans from years of wear, but deep down, I knew it was something else. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind rattled the windows, and the river always heard in the distance seemed louder than usual. The sound of rushing water was almost unnerving, and the river, which had always seemed so tranquil to me as a child, now felt like a living thing. Its presence a constant hum in the back of my mind. Around midnight, I heard a knock at the door. At first, I thought it was a trick of the wind, but then it came again, a soft but deliberate knock, followed by a scraping sound. My heart raced. Who would be out there in the middle of the night? I opened the door cautiously, expecting to find no one, but instead, I found a small, weathered letter lying on the doorstep. The envelope was sealed with a dark red wax, and the handwriting on the front was elegant and curiously familiar. It was addressed to me in my father's handwriting. The letter read, "Do not go near the river tonight. The ferryman is awake, and he comes for those who wander too close." The words sent a chill through me. My father had always warned me about the river, but I had never taken his warnings seriously. Now, standing in the dim light of the hallway, with the snow swirling outside, I could feel the weight of those words pressing down on me. I shoved the letter into my pocket and closed the door, locking it tightly. I tried to convince myself that it was just a silly warning, something from a man who had grown paranoid in his old age. But then, I heard the sound again, the scrape of something dragging across the wooden floor of the hallway. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I slowly stood and crept toward the door. The house seemed unnaturally still. I opened the door, but the hallway was empty. Then, I noticed something else. The snow outside had stopped falling, and the moon was casting an eerie glow over the river. I felt an overwhelming urge to go to the window to see what lay beyond the glass. As I peered out, I saw something that sent a jolt of terror through my chest. A figure stood at the edge of the river, near the old ferry dock. The silhouette was tall, with long, tattered clothing that seemed to flow in the wind. The figure's face was hidden in shadow, but I could make out a long, flowing beard. The figure raised its hand toward me as though beckoning me. I didn't hesitate. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I had heard the stories, the legends of the ferryman, the ghostly figure who roamed the river at night, waiting for unsuspecting travelers to approach. They said he could take anyone across the river, but at a terrible cost. And that cost, they said, was always the soul. I had to leave. I couldn't stay in this town any longer. But as I turned to grab my things, the sound of the door creaked open again. I spun around, only to find that the hallway was empty. The ferryman had already found me.
The following day, I made the decision to leave. I wasn't going to wait for the ferryman to take what I had left, and I wasn't about to test the boundaries of this cursed town. I packed quickly, my mind racing with thoughts of escape. My hands trembled as I loaded my things into the car, every nerve screaming that I needed to get away. As I glanced back at the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to make my move. The snow had stopped falling, but the air was still bitterly cold, as if the very atmosphere had turned against me. The river seemed to call out to me as I walked toward the car, its murmur growing louder and more insistent. I didn't know if I was imagining it, but it felt as though the river was alive with something ancient and malevolent. I slammed the car doors shut and started the engine, but as I drove toward the town's exit, a deep unease settled over me. The streets were eerily empty, no one in sight, no lights on in the houses, no sound of life. It felt like the town itself had been swallowed by the night, leaving only shadows and silence behind. As I neared the bridge that led out of Norrington, I saw it again, the figure standing at the edge of the river, staring out into the dark expanse. The ferryman. His dark silhouette was unmistakable, even in the faint moonlight. He stood still, his back to me, his hands clasped behind him. I tried to ignore him, focusing on the road ahead, but the closer I got to the bridge, the harder it became to look away. The car seemed to slow on its own, as though the engine was struggling to keep going. The headlights flickered, casting strange, ghostly shadows across the road. My heart thudded in my chest, and I could feel the blood rushing in my ears. Suddenly, the ferryman turned. His face was still hidden in shadow, but his eyes glowed. They weren't like human eyes. They were black holes, consuming all the light around them. I froze, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I couldn't move. The car seemed to stop entirely, as if it too was mesmerized by his presence. Then, without warning, he stepped toward the bridge, his movements slow and deliberate. The air grew colder, the wind picking up around me, howling through the trees. I knew that I needed to drive past him, that I needed to leave, but I couldn't. It was like the ferryman's gaze had frozen me in place. His voice, raspy and low, carried across the distance. "You cannot leave, traveler. You've already been chosen." My heart skipped a beat. The words hit me like a physical blow. I wanted to scream, to drive away as fast as I could, but my body refused to cooperate. I was paralyzed by fear. I knew the stories. The ferryman didn't just let anyone leave. Those who tried to escape Norrington were pulled back into the depths of the river, lost forever. The headlights flickered again, and for a moment, everything went dark. In that brief instant of blindness, I felt the car jerk forward. The steering wheel seemed to take on a life of its own, pulling the vehicle toward the bridge with terrifying speed. I slammed my foot on the brake, but it was no use. The car continued forward, as if guided by an unseen force. Then I saw it. The figure standing at the edge of the bridge, his hand raised as if beckoning me toward him. The bridge itself was old, its wooden planks creaking beneath the car's weight. The river churned below, dark and menacing, as though it was waiting for me to come closer. My heart raced as I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles aching from the pressure. In a final, desperate attempt, I slammed my foot onto the accelerator, determined to escape whatever grip the ferryman had on me. But as the car sped forward, the world around me seemed to shift. The road became a blur, the trees twisting and distorting as if they were being swallowed by the night. The engine roared, but it sounded distant, as though it were coming from somewhere far away. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there, standing in the middle of the bridge, was the ferryman. He had stopped, his arms outstretched toward me, his eyes still glowing with that eerie light. The air seemed to crackle with energy, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of cold, like I had plunged into icy water. My breath fogged up the windshield, obscuring my view. I wiped the glass frantically, but it didn't help. The fog thickened, the mist swallowing the car as if it was being pulled into a different world entirely. Then, with a terrifying jolt, the car came to a halt. I looked around, my mind racing, but everything had changed. The world outside the car was gone, replaced by a vast emptiness. There were no roads, no trees, no stars in the sky. Just blackness. I was no longer on the bridge. I was somewhere else. Before I could fully comprehend what was happening, the sound of the river roared to life in my ears, and the car began to shake violently, as if the ground beneath it was shifting. The ferryman's voice echoed in my mind, his words chilling me to my core. "You cannot escape me. You belong to the river now." In that instant, I realized the truth. The ferryman wasn't a ghost or a spirit. He was a manifestation of the river itself, an eternal force that claimed those who wandered too close to its depths. And I, like so many before me, had been marked. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the ferryman's glowing eyes, watching me as I was pulled into the endless void. Story 4. The Forgotten Caller. It was the kind of town you drive through without even realizing it. A small dot on the map, a few streets lined with old houses and a corner store that smelled of stale bread and dust. Cedar Hollow had always been quiet, a place where nothing extraordinary happened. No big businesses, no bustling nightlife, just a handful of people who'd lived there for generations. Samantha Ellis had lived in Cedar Hollow for a year. It wasn't her dream town, but it was a good place to escape to after a tumultuous breakup and the loss of her job. The solitude was a balm, though it also made her restless. The streets were almost always empty, save for the occasional elderly neighbor or a small group of kids playing in the park. Samantha liked it that way. One cold November evening, as she sat in her living room sipping tea, her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. She stared at it for a moment, the name on the caller ID displaying nothing but an area code she didn't recognize. In the silence of her small house, the ringtone felt louder than usual, echoing through the empty space. It wasn't unusual for her to get random calls, wrong numbers, telemarketers, things like that. But something about the call sent a chill down her spine. It was late, too late for anything important. Reluctantly, she picked up the phone. "Hello?" A moment of silence. Then a voice, soft and crackling, like it was coming from far away. "Samantha." Her stomach dropped. "Who is this?" she asked, trying to sound calm. She didn't recognize the voice. It was familiar, but she couldn't place it. Another pause. "I'm sorry, Samantha. I didn't mean to scare you." There was something about the voice that felt wrong. Too distant, too cold. It wasn't a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone she knew. It was strange, hollow, as though the person was speaking from behind a wall, a veil of something she couldn't see. She sat up straighter, her heart beginning to race. "Who is this?" she asked again, firmer this time. But there was no answer. Only static, followed by the faint sound of someone breathing on the other end. The breath seemed to grow louder, more strained. "Samantha." The hairs on her neck stood up. She pulled the phone away from her ear, but the sound of her name hung in the air, almost like it was still echoing in her mind. It was too familiar, too intimate. She didn't want to hang up, but something told her to do so. Her instincts screamed at her to get off the line, to walk away from whatever was happening. But then the voice spoke again, and this time it was different. "Don't go to the park tonight." Samantha froze. Her heart pounded in her chest. The voice sounded so urgent, so certain, as if it knew something she didn't. Before she could respond, the line went dead. The call had ended abruptly, leaving her in the eerie silence of her living room. She stared at the screen for a long time, her finger hovering over the red button to end the call. But it was like she was frozen, her mind racing, trying to process what had just happened. The park. Why would anyone say something like that to her? She wasn't planning on going to the park tonight, anyway. But the words stuck with her, replaying in her mind. "Don't go to the park tonight." She tried to shake it off. It was probably a prank call. Or maybe someone had just gotten the wrong number. But deep down, something nagged at her. A feeling of unease that wouldn't leave her. As the night wore on, she couldn't help but glance out the window. The park wasn't far from her house, just a 5-minute walk down the road. She could see the flickering streetlights and the faint outline of trees swaying in the wind. It was peaceful, too peaceful. The entire town was quiet. Too quiet. And then, as if she was being pulled by an invisible force, her feet carried her toward the door. She didn't want to go, but something compelled her to step outside. She grabbed her coat, her phone, and without thinking, she walked out into the cold night. She didn't go to the park right away. She just wandered the empty streets, unsure of what she was doing or why. Her mind was racing, her pulse quickening with each step. The wind howled through the trees, sending chills down her spine. The streets were deserted. No one else was out this late. No one except her. By the time she reached the park, the moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale light over the empty swings and deserted playground. The air felt heavy, as if the entire town was holding its breath. The call still lingered in her mind, like a warning. But what was she supposed to do with it? Should she leave? Should she call someone? She didn't know. She stood there for a moment, her gaze sweeping across the darkened park. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against her ears. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something move. At first, she thought it was a shadow, something cast by the trees or the streetlights. But when she turned her head, she saw it more clearly, a figure standing near the swings, watching her. She froze. The figure was tall, too tall, and it wasn't moving like a person. It was almost as if it were gliding across the ground, a shadow among shadows. Its movements were unnervingly slow, deliberate. Her heart pounded in her chest, and the hairs on her neck stood up. This wasn't right. This wasn't normal. Samantha took a step back, her eyes fixed on the figure. It didn't move at first. It just stood there, unmoving, staring at her with eyes that she couldn't see, but could somehow feel. The longer she stood there, the more her body screamed for her to run, to leave, but her feet wouldn't move. The figure's head tilted slightly, as if it was studying her. Then, just as she was about to turn and flee, it spoke in a voice that wasn't the voice from the phone, but was somehow even more unsettling. "You were warned," it said, its voice low, chilling, and empty. Samantha's heart skipped a beat. The figure took a step forward. Another. The dark, hollow figure slowly advanced toward her, moving with a strange, fluid grace. The closer it came, the harder it became to breathe. She could feel her chest tightening, the air growing thick with an unnatural heaviness. The voice in her head screamed at her to run, but she couldn't move. Her feet felt glued to the ground. The figure stopped just a few feet away, its form now visible under the faint light of the street lamp. She could make out the silhouette of a tall, gaunt man, his face hidden in shadow, his body wrapped in a long, dark coat. "You should have listened," it whispered. Before she could react, the figure's hand shot out, and in that split second, everything went black. The air in the church was thick with an unsettling tension as the figure stepped fully into the dim light. His face was obscured by the hood, but his presence radiated a chilling aura that gripped the room. For a moment, no one moved or breathed. Everyone in the pew stared, paralyzed by the oppressive silence that filled the space. I felt my legs shake as I stood frozen at the back of the church. The man didn't say anything, but his eyes locked with mine, cold and empty, as though he could see straight through me. I wanted to run, to flee into the night, but my body refused to move. Then, without warning, the man raised his hand. His fingers were unnaturally long, and as they moved, the sound of a distant howl echoed through the church, a howl that seemed to come from deep within the walls. The temperature dropped so fast, and with it, the howl stopped, but the feeling of dread remained. One of the parishioners, an elderly woman named Mrs. Mallory, stood up shakily, her voice trembling. "What do you want? Who are you?" The figure didn't answer. He took a slow step forward, and with each movement, the room seemed to grow darker, colder. His footfalls made no sound against the stone floor. "Please let us go," someone whispered from one of the pews, but the figure only continued moving closer. That's when I saw it. The symbol. It was etched into the floor of the church, hidden beneath the pews, barely visible unless you were looking for it. It was a symbol I recognized from my research. A symbol tied to the ancient rituals of the town, one that was said to open a doorway between the living and the dead. I had learned about it briefly when I was investigating the town's history, but I never imagined it would be connected to something this horrifying. My mind raced as I remembered the details. The last person to have seen this symbol had gone missing years ago. A local historian, who had tried to uncover the secrets buried in the town's past. The historian had vanished without a trace after visiting the old church, leaving only cryptic notes behind. The town had buried the story, pretending it never happened. But I couldn't ignore the truth now. The man standing in front of us wasn't human, and he wasn't alone. I looked around at the people in the pews, some of them frozen with fear, others trembling with tears in their eyes. The air was thick with the stench of something ancient, something that had awoken after decades of silence. Suddenly, the man raised his hand again, and this time, his voice pierced the stillness. It was deep, guttural, and echoed to the walls. "The door is open. The time has come." I felt a rush of panic surge through me as I realized what was happening. The symbol was a gateway, and the man was the key to it. I couldn't just stand there. I had to stop him. I rushed forward, barely conscious of my surroundings. My feet moved instinctively, but my heart pounded in my chest. I reached for the nearest object, an old candle holder from one of the altar tables, and hurled it at the figure. The candle holder collided with the air in front of him, but instead of shattering, it simply froze midair, suspended by some invisible force. "No!" I shouted, but the figure's cold gaze never wavered. The church around us began to tremble, the ground vibrating beneath our feet. I heard whispers, soft, unintelligible voices, coming from all directions. And then, the walls started to bleed. Not with red liquid, but with black ink-like streaks that snaked down the stone, forming shapes and patterns that made no sense. The figure spoke again, this time in a voice that sounded like 1,000 whispers. "You cannot stop it." And just as he spoke, I saw them. Figures emerging from the shadows, slowly making their way down the aisles. They were not fully human. Their eyes were wide and black, their limbs elongated, their faces twisted with unnatural smiles. The whispers grew louder, like an army of voices converging from every corner. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My mind screamed, urging me to run, but I was frozen, locked in place by the sheer horror of what was happening around me. Then, the figure turned and walked toward the altar, his every step seeming to resonate through the church. The strange figures followed him, moving with eerie synchrony. As they reached the altar, they knelt in unison, as though waiting for some unseen command. At that moment, I realized there was no escape. The doors to the church slammed shut once more, and the bell tolled again, louder this time. It was no longer a bell, no longer a sound of tradition or ritual. It was the sound of something far more sinister, a sound that signified the end of everything. I ran. I ran toward the doors, but the closer I got, the farther they seemed. The air around me grew thicker, heavier, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to shift. The church was changing, growing. I could hear the walls groaning, the floorboards creaking, as if the building itself was alive. Behind me, the figure spoke once more. "You can't escape. You're already part of it." I didn't look back. I don't know how I made it out of the church. Maybe it was the panic that fueled me, maybe it was luck, but somehow I stumbled out into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap to the face, but it didn't matter. I was free, at least for the moment. But I know I can't stay here. The town, the church, and the figures inside, they won't stop until they get what they want. The gate is open, and there's no closing it now. If you're reading this, please don't come to Carrigmore. The door is already open, and once you step inside, there's no way back. Story 5. The Hollow Eyes of Mooncrest, USA. The town of Mooncrest sat quietly on the edge of the forest, a place few people ever thought to visit. Nestled in the hills of Northern California, Mooncrest was the kind of town people often passed through but never settled in. It was small, isolated, and not a place you'd expect to find a thriving community. There were whispers about the town, of course. No place like Mooncrest could remain completely off the map without sparking some rumors. People talked about the strange things that happened at night, about the folks who disappeared without a trace, and the way the town's history seemed to blur together in strange and unnatural ways. But when you live in a place like Mooncrest, you either learn to ignore the whispers, or they consumed you. I had only been in Mooncrest for a few weeks when I started hearing the stories. My name is Andrew, and I had come here to take a job as the new sheriff. The previous sheriff had disappeared mysteriously, his vanishing one of the many unsolved puzzles in a town already riddled with secrets. I'd come from a small town in Oregon, thinking a fresh start in a quiet place would be ideal. I had no idea what I was walking into. As soon as I arrived, I noticed how cold the town felt. The air seemed heavy, thick with something I couldn't quite place. People barely spoke to me, and when they did, it was with a nervous glance over their shoulder. One of the first things I noticed was the old church on the edge of town. It was a dilapidated building, the paint peeling off the wooden frame, and the steeple sagging as though it had given up hope of ever being beautiful again. But there was something strange about it, something off about the way the doors always stayed open, no matter the time of day or night. One evening, as I walked past the church, I saw a shadow move inside. I stopped dead in my tracks. I hadn't seen anyone enter, and the door hadn't creaked open. But I knew someone was inside. I couldn't explain it. I turned quickly and walked away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was the next night when things truly started to unravel. I was sitting in my office when I heard a knock on the door. It was late, well past midnight. I opened it to find an older man standing there. His hair was white, and his face was pale, almost sickly. His eyes were wide, too wide, and there was something unsettling about his expression. "Sheriff," he said, his voice shaky, "I need to tell you something. Something you need to know." He stepped into my office without waiting for an invitation, and before I could say anything, he spoke again, his words coming out in a rush. "There's something wrong in this town, something that has been here for a long time. Something terrible that no one will talk about. It's been going on for years, Sheriff. I don't know how much longer we have." His voice trailed off, and I could see that he was trembling. His eyes kept darting to the window, and I noticed how his hands shook. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to stay calm, but inside, a knot was already forming in my stomach. "The eyes," he said quietly, almost in a whisper. "The hollow eyes. They come at night." I stared at him, unsure of what he meant. "The people," he continued, his voice growing weaker. "The ones who disappear. The ones who are never found. They don't leave. They're still here. And they have hollow eyes now. All of them." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could speak, he suddenly jerked back, his face going white as a sheet. "They're watching," he whispered urgently. "They're always watching. You need to leave this place. You need to leave before." He cut off, his eyes wide with terror. The door slammed open on its own, the wind howling in from the street. The man turned and ran, his feet stumbling as he bolted into the night. I ran after him, but when I reached the street, he was gone. I searched the area for hours, but there was no sign of him. I returned to my office, shaken, and sat down in my chair. The man's words echoed in my mind, the hollow eyes. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat awake, listening to the wind howl through the cracks in the old building, and the only thing I could think about was the church. I had to know more about what he had said. I had to know what had happened to those people. the ones who had disappeared. I couldn't resist anymore. I had to go to the church. The cold air grew even thicker as I stumbled back from the door, the overwhelming sensation of being trapped crawling up my spine. I reached for the handle again, pushing with all my strength, but the door remained stubbornly locked, as though something, or someone, was holding it shut from the other side. The whispers from the darkened corners of the room grew louder, a chorus of voices, low and guttural, echoing off the stone walls of the church. The sound surrounded me, making it impossible to pinpoint where they were coming from. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat a loud reminder of the terror that had taken hold of me. I couldn't make sense of the voices, but I could feel the presence, pressing in on me from all directions. The hollow eyes, those black pits in the walls and corners, seemed to grow brighter, their empty gaze intensifying as if feeding off my fear. I blinked rapidly, trying to shake the image of them from my mind, but they were everywhere, on the ceiling, in the shadows, and even on the floor beneath me. No matter how hard I tried to look away, they followed me. I turned to face the altar, where the ancient wooden cross loomed, its silhouette stark against the dim light. My mind raced, desperately trying to understand what was happening, but the answers remained just out of reach. The whispers grew louder, their intensity increasing with each passing second. My thoughts felt muddled, clouded by fear and the overwhelming sense that something was about to happen, something terrible. I had to get out. There had to be a way. I reached out, hands trembling, and grabbed the edge of a nearby pew for support. The cold wood felt unnervingly smooth under my fingertips, as if it had been wiped clean, polished by the unseen forces that now seemed to control the room. I didn't dare take another step toward the altar. I could feel the weight of something powerful, something ancient, watching me from the dark recesses of the church. Suddenly, the whispers ceased. Everything went still. The only sound was my own labored breathing, and the unsettling quiet felt like a warning. I could feel the temperature drop even further, the cold sinking deep into my bones. And then I heard something else, a sound so faint it might have been my imagination, but so unmistakable I couldn't ignore it. A soft, slow tapping. It came from behind me, rhythmic and deliberate, as though someone, or something, was walking toward me, each step echoing louder and louder. I froze, my body paralyzed by the overwhelming sense of dread that gripped me. The tapping continued, the sound growing nearer, until it seemed to be just inches from my ear. I didn't dare turn around. A voice, smooth but cold, broke the silence. "You shouldn't have come here, Sheriff," it whispered. The words were slow, deliberate, and laced with an unnatural calm that made my skin crawl. "You're not supposed to be here. You're not supposed to see." I couldn't speak. My mouth had gone dry, my throat constricting. The voice was right. It felt wrong, as though I had crossed some unseen boundary that should never have been crossed. I wanted to run, to escape, but the thought of turning my back to the presence behind me paralyzed me with terror. And then, from the darkness, I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, slowly emerging from the shadows near the altar. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as it stepped into the faint glow of the candles, I could see it clearly. It was a man, or something that resembled a man, but its features were blurred, like a reflection on water that ripples and distorts. Its face was shrouded in shadows, and its eyes were dark, blacker than anything I had ever seen. And then I saw them, the hollow eyes. They were not just in the walls or the shadows anymore. They were on this figure too. Empty, lifeless eyes, dozens of them, scattered across its face and body, looking in every direction but never meeting mine. They moved, following my every twitch, every breath, every heartbeat. The figure took a step forward, and I took a step back. It spoke again, its voice now louder, a low growl that reverberated through the church. "You came for the truth," it said, the words dripping with a malevolent intent. "But the truth has a price, Sheriff, and you have to pay it." I could feel the weight of its words sinking into my chest, a suffocating pressure that made it harder to breathe. It took another step, its feet making no sound on the cold stone floor. And then the eyes, the hollow eyes, began to change. They shifted, flickered like broken lights, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. Behind each hollow eye, something moved. A shadow. A reflection of something far darker, far older than I could comprehend. And with each movement, the shadows grew longer, as though the very darkness inside them was alive, hungry. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran. I barreled toward the door, but it remained locked. The tapping behind me grew louder, more urgent, like footsteps that could never be outrun. I could hear the figure's voice again, its whispering words trailing behind me. "You can't escape, Sheriff. The town has claimed you. You will never leave." The door shook violently, rattling as though something was trying to break through. Panic surged through me. I pulled and yanked at the door, desperation clawing at my chest. My pulse was a drumbeat in my ears, louder than the whispers, louder than the tapping. Finally, the door gave way. I stumbled out into the night, my feet unsteady as I crashed into the cold air. I looked back once, but the church had vanished. The dark, foreboding silhouette was gone, replaced by the normal, quiet streets of Mooncrest. I don't know how long I stood there, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The whispers had stopped, the eyes had disappeared, but the terror remained. And as I looked toward the distant hills, I knew one thing for sure: I was never leaving Mooncrest. Story 5. The Whispering Pines, USA. The town of Pinefield, located in the remote hills of Western Virginia, was forgotten by most. It wasn't on the map, and the only time its name was mentioned was when travelers got lost on the winding back roads that veered off the main highways. But for the people who lived there, Pinefield was everything. They grew up there, married there, and raised families there. They never left. And for good reason. Caitlin Harris never intended to return. She'd left Pinefield behind years ago after high school, leaving behind the small town she'd once called home, escaping to the city for a life of opportunity and excitement. But when her father passed away suddenly, Caitlin found herself back in the place she had tried to forget. The house she had grown up in was now hers, and with it, the responsibility of sorting through her father's belongings and preparing the house for sale. It wasn't long before the eerie feeling of the town crept up on her again. The unsettling quiet. The strange way people looked at her when she walked down Main Street. It was like they all knew something she didn't, something she was too afraid to ask about. The first night Caitlin spent in her old home, the silence was deafening. It was nothing like the bustling city she had come from. Pinefield was tucked away in the forest, its isolation almost suffocating. The only sounds were the occasional creak of the house settling, the wind rustling through the trees outside, and the distant hoot of an owl. Caitlin had trouble sleeping. She'd barely closed her eyes when she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It came from downstairs. She froze, listening in the dark. Her heart began to race as she strained to hear. The whispering continued, faint but steady, like someone was speaking just below the surface of the air. She crept out of bed and walked quietly down the staircase, her breath shallow, every muscle in her body tense. The whispering was louder now. It was coming from the living room. As she stepped into the room, the sound stopped. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, the kind that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Caitlin felt a chill run down her spine, and for a brief moment, She thought she saw a figure standing in the corner of the room, a dark shape, just beyond the reach of the dim light from the lamp. But when she blinked, it was gone. The next morning, Caitlin tried to shake off the fear. She chalked it up to the stress of losing her father, the weight of the task ahead of her, and the isolation of the house. But as the day wore on, things only got stranger. As she sorted through her father's longings, she found something she hadn't expected. Tucked away in an old box in the attic was a faded notebook. It was small, leather-bound, with yellowing pages. Caitlin opened it cautiously, unsure of what she might find. The handwriting was her father's. She recognized it immediately. But the words were unsettling. The whispers never stop. The pines are watching. The town will always stay, but you won't. The rest of the notebook was filled with similar entries, strange ramblings that didn't make sense. As Caitlin flipped through the pages, a chill ran down her spine. Her father had never mentioned the pines or any of the eerie things he had written about. Why hadn't he told her? That night, as Caitlin sat alone in the dark, the whispers returned. But this time, they were louder, more urgent, as though they were calling her name. She rushed to the window, her heart pounding in her chest, but all she saw was the same quiet street. No one was there. No movement. Nothing out of place. Except the trees. The pines, just outside her window, seemed to shift in the wind, their branches swaying like they were alive. Caitlin turned away quickly, her mind racing with fear and confusion. But the whispers wouldn't stop. In the morning, Caitlin went to the town library to find answers. She asked the librarian, an elderly woman named Margaret, about the strange occurrences she had been experiencing. Margaret's face went pale when Caitlin mentioned the whispers. "I thought you'd be the one to ask," she said quietly, almost nervously. "Your father, he was the last one to know. The town's secret. You're not the first to hear the whispers, Caitlin. But there's no stopping it once they start." Caitlin's mind raced as Margaret continued. She told Caitlin about an old legend that had been passed down through the generations of Pinesfield. It was said that the town was built on land cursed by the spirits of the forest. The whispers were a warning, a sign that something terrible was coming. And once the whispers started, there was no turning back. "They've been calling to you," Margaret said softly. "They've been waiting." Caitlin didn't know what to believe, but as she left the library, the weight of Margaret's words hung heavy in her mind. She couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. The pines were watching, and something was coming for her. As she walked back to her father's house, the sky began to darken, and the wind picked up. The trees swayed ominously, and the whispers grew louder. They seemed to be everywhere now, surrounding her, calling her name. She quickened her pace, but it felt like the town itself was closing in on her. When she arrived home, the door was ajar. The house was empty, but she could feel the presence of something watching her. The pines outside the window rattled in the wind, their dark branches twisting like skeletal fingers reaching toward the house. And from somewhere deep in the forest, the whispers called her name. Caitlin stepped inside, her hand shaking. The air felt thick, heavy with the promise of something terrible. She needed to know the truth. She needed to find out what had happened to her father, and why the town had never spoken of the curse. But as she moved deeper into the house, she knew one thing for sure. Whatever was waiting for her in the woods, it wasn't something she could escape. The wind howled outside, rattling the old wooden house, but inside, the air was deathly still. Caitlin stood frozen in the dimly lit hallway, the notebook still in her hands, the weight of her father's words sinking in. The door creaked again as it swayed in the breeze, and the distant, yet unmistakable whispers returned, louder this time, like 1,000 voices calling from the depths of the pines. She turned and faced the staircase, the same staircase she had climbed as a child, the steps creaking under her feet as she ascended. Each step seemed to echo too loudly in the house, a constant reminder that the silence outside was merely an illusion. Her pulse quickened, her breathing shallow as she reached the top. The long hallway stretched out before her, with doors to the bedrooms on either side. All of them, she knew, still held memories of her childhood, memories that, just a few hours ago, felt like they belonged to someone else. But now, the house felt wrong. Caitlin approached the door to her old bedroom, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. The door creaked open, the familiar scent of old wood and dust filling her nostrils. The room hadn't changed since she left. The wallpaper was still peeling in the corners, the small bed covered with a faded quilt, and the window with its cracked pane letting in just enough light from the street lamp outside to cast eerie shadows on the walls. Her gaze moved to the small desk by the window where she used to sit, writing letters or doing homework. The chair was still in place, and beside it, a small chest sat in the corner, locked and unused. But it was what lay on the desk that made her blood run cold. A single page of paper, yellowed with age, lay on top of the old notebook she had left behind. And written on it, in a handwriting that she immediately recognized as her father's, was one word: leave. Caitlin's heart pounded in her chest as she reached for the page, her fingers trembling. She knew it was a warning. Her father had known something. He had left it for her, left it in her room for a reason. He had been trying to protect her. But from what? Suddenly, the whispers returned, this time, right behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty. The whispers were all around her. Her breathing quickened as she backed up toward the window, her gaze snapping between the dark pines outside and the shadowed corners of the room. The wind picked up again, howling against the house, but Caitlin could feel something else. A shift. Something had changed. She stepped backward, feeling the floor beneath her vibrate, but when her foot hit the edge of the desk, the room seemed to freeze. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it, until the floorboards groaned. Not from the weight of her movement, but from something heavier. Her eyes darted to the chest in the corner. It was moving, slowly at first, as though something inside it was stirring, as though the chest itself were alive. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, filling her ears. And then, with a violent jolt, the chest flung open on its own. Caitlin screamed as she stumbled backward, her body crashing into the wall. From the chest, something crawled out, a figure, hunched and twisted, its skin pale and translucent, its limbs far too long for its body. Its head hung low, obscured by a mop of black hair that shifted in the wind. But its eyes were the worst. They were black, devoid of any light, unblinking, and fixated on her. The whispers stopped. The creature stood there, motionless, staring at her. Caitlin couldn't move. Her body was frozen, her legs unwilling to respond as she watched the thing shuffle closer, its limbs scraping across the floor like nails on chalkboard. It stopped inches from her, its head tilting unnaturally to one side. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping drastically as if the creature itself was sucking all the warmth from the room. Then, in a voice that wasn't quite human, it spoke. "You are the last." The words echoed in Caitlin's mind, the meaning twisting and warping inside her head. What did it mean? The last of what? The creature reached out a long, bony hand, and Caitlin instinctively backed away, her heart racing. The thing's fingers were like claws, elongated and sharp, reaching for her with a predatory intent. "Leave, Caitlin," the voice seemed to say, but this time, it was her father's voice. It was faint, like a whisper carried on the wind, and yet it felt like he was standing right behind her. Suddenly, The creature let out a shrill scream that pierced the stillness of the room. It was a sound that felt like it was tearing her apart from the inside out. The room began to spin, and Caitlin clutched her head in agony. Everything went dark. When Caitlin regained consciousness, she found herself lying on the floor, her body aching, her mind dizzy with confusion. The room was still, and the creature was gone. The chest was shut again, its surface undisturbed as if nothing had happened. But she knew it had. She could feel it in the air. The presence of something ancient, something that had been watching her, waiting for her return. The whispers began again, this time in her mind. Leave. Caitlin stumbled to her feet, the room still spinning as she rushed toward the door. She had to get out. She had to leave before it came back. But when she reached the door, her hand stopped midair. The door was no longer there. It was a solid wall. The house had changed. She was trapped.
Thanks for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. Terramouth.